лузі червона калина похилилася. Чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. Марширують наші добровольці у кривавих танках, визволяти братів українців з московських кайдан. А ми ці московські кайдани розірвемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. Не хилися, червона калина, маєш білий цвіт. Не журися, славна Україно, маєш вільний рід. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. Гей, у полі ярої пшениці золотистий лан. Розпочало військо українське з ворогами тан. А ми тую ярою пшеницю і зберемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. Ой, у лузі червона калина похилилася. Чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо.
Червона калина похилилася. Чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася.
А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. Ой, у лузі червона калина похилилася. Чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. Ой, у лузі червона калина похилилася. Чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо.
Ой, у лузі червона калина похилилася. Чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми на наші добровольці у кривавий танк визволяти братів українців з ворожих кайдан. А ми наших братів українців визволимо, а ми нашу славну Україну, гей, гей, розвеселимо. Не хилися, червона калино, маєш білий цвіт. Не журися, славна Україно, маєш вільний рід. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну, гей, гей, розвеселимо. Ми героям рідної країни шлемо наш привіт. І з молитвою за Україну вже співа весь світ. І освітні фронти, волонтерська допомога. ЗСУ веде нас всіх до мрії, наша перемога. В серці завжди віра та надія, незабутній час. Змінотворці, ваша суперсила надихає нас. З нами ви у кожному куточку батьківщини. Вчителі важливі, пам'ятаємо, слава Україні!
Thank you so much. Well, welcome. I want to thank everyone for their participation in this event and extend a warm welcome to all of those joining us. We're taking on this vital topic of inner and outer democracy and the threat of authoritarianism at a crucial time amidst continued suffering and struggle on the part of our Ukrainian colleagues. Authoritarianism, inner and outer, is an issue not only in war-torn Ukraine, but throughout the world. On both a personal and collective level, the rise of authoritarianism affects us all. The Ukrainian people's unwavering resilience and their pursuit of democracy amidst a worsening humanitarian crisis serve as a powerful backdrop to today's discussion. After months of war, some 18 million people are estimated to need humanitarian aid. 5 million Ukrainians are internally displaced, while another 6 million are living as refugees in other countries. Civilian deaths are high, and constant shelling continues to terrorize communities. For families, especially those living close to the front lines, sources of support are becoming scarce, and coping strategies are wearing thin. With winter just a few months off, there is great concern about the continued attacks on civilian infrastructure that communities depend on for food, commerce, and heating. In flagrant violation of international laws, Russia is planting landmines, inflicting torture, and using food as a weapon. As the war becomes a protracted crisis, our Ukrainian colleagues and their families are facing unimaginable suffering. On an individual level, suffering has a way of separating us from others. The grieving mother finds herself shunned and alone because others cannot bear to be close to such misfortune and anguish. The pain feels too big and too unknowable, so we say, there are no words, and move on. When we become the victim of devastating, wrenching loss, we become cast out of the circle of normal life. We no longer belong to the world of the living, for we have been claimed by underworld forces that others don't want to countenance. So too with collective trauma and loss. When our communities are beset by war, or when we face the risk of erasure, we wonder whether we have been exiled from the rest of humanity. Do we bear these troubles alone? Do others know that we suffer? Do they care? At such times, it is deeply meaningful when others turn toward us rather than away from us. When people reach out to listen and console rather than ignore or recoil from us. As we reel to consider what evil humans are capable of, it grounds us to know that there are those who do not look away, but extend a hand of solace and compassion. Barbara Hanna tells us that in 1954, Jung was asked whether he thought there would ever be a nuclear war. His answer can guide our thinking about destructive collective tragedies such as the war in Ukraine. Here is what he said. I think it depends on how many people can stand the tension of the opposites in themselves. In other words, the answer to these pressing, urgent collective crises resides fundamentally in the individual. Today, Donald Kalsched brings us an important exploration of democracy, inner and outer. Ukraine's struggle for democratic ideals serves as a poignant reminder of the fragility of democracy and the enduring human quest for freedom and self-expression. And now I hope you'll join me for a minute of silence as we acknowledge all of those who are suffering, those who have died, been tortured, or injured. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers and panelists. Oxana Zaleska has been working with children for over 26 years. The last 9 years, she has been working with the consequences of war. She has adopted the Jungian method of serial drawing for use in emergency situations for children affected by the war, and is the co-author of the psychosocial program Safe Space, which has been implemented in Ukraine in the education system since 2015 and is aimed at supporting and preventing PTSD among children. Elena Brante was born and grown up in Ukraine, and for the last 6 years, she has lived in Ireland. She was trained as a Jungian analyst in the Ukrainian Development Group. Her main areas of interest are trauma, narcissism, and immigration. And finally, Don Kalsched's work is well known to all of us in the Jungian world. His books on trauma have been perhaps the most important theoretical contribution to the field in recent decades. I'm fortunate enough to have been taught by Don on several occasions, and I've always gained so much from his deep insights, warmth, and humanity. The paper that he brings us today is another important contribution to our field, using Jung's insights to illuminate a vital dynamic in the collective. And now I'll turn it over to you, Don.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And thank you to all the people that have organized this. I'm very pleased to be a part of this webinar and all things that have to do with trying to support our colleagues in Ukraine. At this time in history, all over the world, democracy is fighting for its life against the growing threat of authoritarianism. In Ukraine, this battle is being waged every day against a brutal authoritarian regime, with Ukrainian soldiers dying in trenches and women and children dying in the streets. Underneath the agony and unspeakable grief of this fight for democracy, there lies a deep moral and spiritual value that those of us fortunate enough to live in democracies sometimes experience, and that ultimately our Ukrainian colleagues are fighting for. It is a deep value that is only glimpsed in the human and interhuman struggles and conflicts that are made possible by freedom and liberty in a democratic system. And even then, only at certain heartfelt moments, like Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg, or Nelson Mandela's inaugural address at the Cape of Good Hope, or Barack Obama's election night victory at Grant Park in Chicago. These moments have a transcendence about them that seems to come from a struggle between opposites that resolves itself in a mysterious third. They are healing moments when deep feelings are touched. They are also moments when the spirit soars. In authoritarian governments, the spirit doesn't soar, it marches. The democratic moments of transcendence I'm describing move us in ways that only a life lived in freedom can move us. And democracy is best understood as a constant struggle for that freedom, a struggle against the inevitable threat of authoritarianism, a struggle that never ends, and also always a struggle within democracy itself. I want to try to talk about this struggle today and to illustrate it with an individual psychotherapy case in which that deep value shone through in certain moments. I came to understand that the struggle for a democracy of the psyche and for that deep moral and spiritual value inherent in a democratic process has to do with the relationship between democracy and consciousness, a relationship that was very precious to Jung. Last year, as the current war in Ukraine was beginning, I tried in a letter to Ukrainian colleagues to express this ineffable connection between democracy and consciousness. So I'm going to repeat the relevant paragraph in my letter here. Quote, "Your battle is part of that revolution in consciousness. Dictators will always rise up against this new consciousness because they are afraid of it. But the fight for democracy, for equality, for diversity, and for the sacred reality that all people on this planet contain the spark of a God-given right to life and liberty is far bigger than any one battle, and it must be waged over and over again in every generation. Those of you who work with traumatized individuals know that this is the same battle waged in the inner world between a life-promoting new democratic consciousness and the violent, oppressive anti-life forces in the psyche. Now you are engaging this battle in the streets. You are fighting for more than survival. You are fighting for a new birth of freedom and for a new and revolutionary consciousness that is slowly taking place on this earth against great resistance. You are fighting for a transcendent moral center for your nation. Despite your current trauma, you are fighting for the soul. I salute you. Now, in the trauma work I do with individual patients, I've come to realize that I am frequently helping my patients to fight for a democracy of the psyche against the tyranny of an authoritarian inner system of defenses organized around existential fear and anxiety. This system, which I call the self-care system, is an effort by what Jung called the primordial self, with a capital S, to regulate the infant psyche following the chaos, pain, and fragmentation of early trauma. The primary agent of this regulation is the defense of dissociation. By looking at the inner systems of dissociation that emerge to regulate the personality in the aftermath of trauma, we may gain a better understanding of how authoritarianism takes root, first in the psyche and then in the world. In my paper today, I'll be describing my work with a man whose psyche had been taken over by just such an authoritarian system of violent defenses. In his inner world, the vulnerable childlike parts of himself were ruthlessly and maliciously oppressed by a powerful inner tyrant. These sensitive and soulful parts of my patient were the key to the fuller life that he wanted, but they had no rightful place in his inner legislature, no voice or vote in the parliament of his psyche when we began. These needy and dependent parts of him were always getting him into trouble. At least that's how his controlling inner tyrant saw it. And so they had to be ruthlessly repressed, even eliminated if necessary. Now we have a word for this kind of elimination in the psyche. It's called dissociation. And it leads inevitably to authoritarianism. Jung spoke a great deal about dissociation in relationship to what he called the complexes. But the dissociation I'll be speaking about today is a more severe form, developmentally earlier in a child's life, well before the child's experience has even been formulated into complexes, and much more violent than the milder defenses such as repression. It operates to kill our awareness of pain that has been unbearable, or to anesthetize our painful feelings in general so they never become conscious. This kind of dissociation, therefore, appears to attack all the connections between unwanted, vulnerable parts of the self and the ego. Dissociation starts out as an effort at self-regulation. But because dissociation is a defense, its only agency is negation, disconnection from feeling, closing off, constriction, fragmentation. It can't create anything or put anything new together. It tries to control feelings of pain and fear by controlling and dominating the vulnerable parts of the self that it thinks are the root of this pain and fear. This leads to a kind of autoimmune disease of the psyche, with one part of the whole attacking a less acceptable part. Such inward oppression is the essence of authoritarianism and constitutes a slow form of suicide. In the therapy process with my patient Mike, you will witness a struggle to save a democracy of the psyche from the authoritarian tyranny of such violence. This was a struggle for a more inclusive, accepting inner system, where even the least of these, referenced by Jesus in Matthew 25:40, could have a voice in the government of the self. With Mike, I found myself struggling to create an interpersonal container that could house and hold the polar opposites of his inner world and mine. His inner world was a seething cauldron of opposites, some of them unconscious of each other. There was his innocent childlike vulnerability opposed by primitive violence or smothered by sentimental love. His hopeful reaching out for love opposed by ruthless self-sufficiency. His tender, loving nature opposed by his machismo toughness and stony indifference. Mike had never had a loving relationship with a parent or caretaker strong enough to contain the Sturm und Drang of these primitive, conflicting parts of himself in relationship. He had never been able to cry and scream and be needy and dependent and rage against his constraints and be heard and have his feelings matter to someone. In fact, he had tried repeatedly to express himself, but his feelings had been beaten out of him by his militaristic father. So what started out as inner conflict became his conflict with the world. He was no longer at war with himself. He was at war with an unfeeling world and with the people in it that he cared most about, including me. You could say that the opposites inside him had become almost completely externalized, breaking free of inner containment, rampaging through his world, creating all the disorder in his life. So what kind of psyche can contain such opposites? Well, Jung was very clear about that. A democratic psyche, he said. According to Jung, the normal, healthy personality comes into being as an assemblage of multiple parts. Even the ego at first is like an archipelago of islands in a sea of unconsciousness. For the newborn baby, experiences start out like flash pictures of sensation, affect, images, or scraps of memory. Slowly, these cohere into moving pictures, and a central witnessing ego begins to integrate them into cohesive identity. But this identity has many facets, many feeling parts, some inferior and in conflicts with other superior parts. If the growing child is lucky enough to have loving and attuned caretakers, then these conflicting feelings can be expressed, processed, integrated, without being excluded or banished from awareness. Different I positions can be held in tension without threatening the integrity of the person. This is what Jung meant by a democracy of the psyche. Another word for it is a conflict psychology. Authoritarianism cannot tolerate inner conflict, so it displaces one pole of the conflict into the world. The psychological word for this is projection, and its mechanism is dissociation. What's true for the individual is also true for the group. As a new nation emerges into history, it does so as an assembly of many parts. In collective life, we know these parts as different tribes or races or genders or immigrant groups or subgroups with different religions or sexual preferences. The health of a nation depends on how compatibly these opposing constituencies can coexist with one another. Conflict is inevitable, but the question is, can it be held by the institutions, laws, founding documents, and traditions of a culture, producing the rich ferment of community life and creativity for a nation that is possible in a democracy? Jung lived in Switzerland, one of the longest lasting democracies. In a BBC talk in 1946 called The Fight with the Shadow, Jung said, "In Switzerland, we have built up the perfect democracy, where our warlike instincts expend themselves in the form of domestic quarrels called political life. We fight each other within the limits of the law and the Constitution, and we're inclined to think of democracy as a chronic state of mitigated civil war. We are far from being at peace with ourselves. On the contrary, We hate and fight each other because we have succeeded in introverting war. Introverting war. So the process of suffering the opposites inwardly defines democracy for Jung. It takes great courage and, above all, emotional competence and resilience to do this. Emotional competence is something that can be developed, but it involves psychological suffering. Therefore, it is hard won and easily lost. Such competence defines the health of an individual and also of a group. But there's something more about democracy that makes it what Jung calls a highly psychological institution. For Jung, the very evolution of consciousness on this planet depends upon our ability to hold the tension between opposites inwardly. The dynamic struggle between opposites in the psyche is what produces consciousness. Jung was unique in understanding that democracy was a developmental achievement over other authoritarian systems, inwardly and outwardly. Consciousness advances as two opposing sides are held in tension long enough to produce a transcendent third thing. Jung called this mysterious third the transcendent function, and he saw this dialectic as the way consciousness advances in the psyche and in the world. The transcendent function was Jung's name for that deep moral and spiritual value at the heart of our struggle for greater consciousness that I referenced at the beginning of this paper. So democracy at its best is more than just another way of organizing the parts of the self or the parts of a nation. Despite all its inefficiency and disputatious wrangling, at its best, inner and outer democracy promotes the kind of suffering of opposing feelings and opinions that is necessary to produce consciousness. By contrast, authoritarianism driven by fear dissociates the warring opposites in the name of order and control and trades its inner complexity and freedom for security. This means dissociation of the opposites and hence unconsciousness. Here's what Jung has to say about the suffering necessary to contain conflict and promote an inner democracy of the psyche. Quote, if the projected conflict is to be healed, it must return into the psyche of the individual where it had its unconscious beginnings. He must celebrate a Last Supper with himself and eat his own flesh and drink his own blood, which means that he must recognize and accept the inferior other in himself. This is not a popular recipe for running a personal life or a public country. Now we can show the slide. Neil, can you put the slide up? Thank you. The system of authoritarian defenses that I've discovered in my early trauma patients, I call the self-care system. Here's an image of this system and its two major archetypal powers. This is an illustration by William Blake called The Good and Evil Angels Fight for Possession of a Child. I've come to understand these angels as personifications of primitive, archetypal, dissociative powers in the psyche, whereas the child I see as a personification of the human vulnerability in their power. The two angels were born in the volcanic eruption of trauma, and they are both drawn to and repulsed by the vulnerable human failings of the child in their care. It is important to realize that these archetypal powers belong to the collective layer of the psyche. They are therefore coordinated by what Jung called the self and constitute what Michael Fordham called defenses of the self. Eventually, they will have to be humanized and come under ego control. But this process of humanization will be a humiliation of them, for them, and they will resist it with a vengeance. They are authoritarian beings from the collective unconscious, and they do not wish to be democratized. In order to dissociate the vulnerable child in their care, the dissociative system appears to use two opposing energies represented by these two angels. One is aggression and violence. That's the dark angel on the left. The other is self-soothing and illusion, psychic numbing and the casting of spells, including addictions. That's the job of the bright angel on the right, into whose arms the terrified child is fleeing. Both of these are affect deadening defenses. One angel disconnects and disintegrates. The other encapsulates and provides necessary illusions, myths to live by. One angel is protective and the other is persecutory, but both serve the project of dissociating the ego from the unbearable painful feelings in reality and vested in that child in the system. The dark angel's violence and malevolence towards the wounded child in the inner world was shocking to me when I first encountered it in the dreams of trauma survivors. But I discovered many other psychoanalytic clinicians who have identified such a tyrannical inner objects in their patients' material. Michael Sebeck spoke of inner totalitarian objects as internalized parental objects magnified by the child's dependency. Wilfred Bion spoke of a destructive superego, an inner god, hostile to the acquisition of emotional experience, who attacks the links among all the parts of the inner world. Ronald Fairbairn described an internal saboteur attacking an innocent, regressed libidinal ego. And Anne Hallward describes an inner fascist regime whose goal is to silence and isolate us, thereby increasing our shame. My own work has identified this inner figure as an archetypal defense personified by Dante in his famous Divine Comedy as the horrific monster Dis, D-I-S, who operates in a hellish interior world full of alienated feelings and fragmented parts of traumatic memory. Dis, I thought, was an appropriate name for him, that is, the Lord of Dissociation. His violence is the more obvious of the two angelic powers within the system and leads inevitably to the authoritarian mindset. The voice of Dis in the inner world of the patient is uncompromisingly negative and critical. If the child falls into his arms, it is immediately filled with shame and an inner sense of being bad and utterly worthless. By contrast, the bright angel tries to shore up the inner child's disillusionment with alternative idealized realities that are less painful. It is up to this angel to counter the dark angel's negativity with positive things, thereby sustaining hope, even though this hope may be illusory hope, a kind of false hope, or what Martha Stark has called relentless hope. This is the angel responsible for what various therapists have called spiritual bypass, which is an effort to avoid painful feelings in the body by going up into the head, into the spirit world, where alternative realities seem possible. Conspiracy theories are a specialty of the bright angel in the self-care system, who is a master of disinformation whenever reality gets too painful to accept. If the bright angel can gin up enough fear and outrage, it justifies and feeds the dark angel's violence. The two of these angels work in tandem. The important thing to keep in mind is that these are mythic powers, violence and illusion, titanic emotions present in all of us. They define two extremes of the authoritarian mindset. In a healthier person, they might be present as healthy aggression on the one hand and healthy creative imagination on the other. But in the traumatized person whose inner world has been hijacked by fear, these archetypal powers are not available for authentic living, but are recruited for defensive purposes. In psychological language, they are ever-present temptations towards either positive or negative inflation, idealizations or diabolizations, but nothing in between, which is where we live, down here on Middle Earth, where human love and human hate are possible. Finally, in our image of the self-care system, we see the child fleeing into the arms of the bright angel. As mentioned, I see this child as the historical inner child of the patient, the human vulnerability and hurt suffered in a traumatic past, the least of these referenced in Jesus' parable cited above. I have found that all healing of trauma must go through this wounded inner child. This means inviting this child into presence in the field constellated by therapy. In turn, this means striking a bargain with the guardian angel, the angels, who do not wish to release this inner child into relationship with somebody outside the system. When the wounded child comes to presence in psychotherapy, he often brings something more into our awareness. As the missing third, this mystery can appear as an ineffable quality, a transpersonal dimension to the work that is hard to describe or define. The experience of grace comes close. Jung's essay on the child archetype is an effort to approach this mystery. There he speaks about the divine child as an image of the human soul. Okay, I'd like now to introduce you to my work with Mike to illustrate how the self-care system takes root and is slowly transformed in psychotherapy. Mike was a likable, attractive, hypermasculine, narcissistic man when I first met him, about 230 pounds, over 6 feet 2 inches tall. He was referred by his wife for anger issues, which involved road rage incidents that had gotten him into trouble with the police. But in addition to these incidents, the main problem now and the issue his wife was most worried about was that Mike was starting to have uncontrollable fears and anxieties about losing his newborn baby son, an infant who had been born with a condition of severe jaundice and was especially fragile. The baby was out of danger now and safely at home, but Mike still could not stop worrying and obsessing. He spent many sleepless nights standing over the baby's crib, checking his breathing, crying over the imagined loss of him. In his initial sessions, Mike was so dysregulated by storms of affect and fragmented scraps of memory that he had to talk to me while pacing back and forth like a caged animal in my consulting room. Gradually, over several weeks, he settled down and we began to explore his early history, which included regular naked beatings with a wooden paddle by his father from the age of 2 onward. In these abusive episodes, Mike refused to cry, and as he put it, never gave his father the satisfaction of, quote, breaking him. Devoted to his mother, Mike became inconsolable at 18 months of age when his younger brother was born. He acted out, ran away to neighbors, broke things in his rages. Severe punishment always followed. For example, his father would lock him into a collar around his neck and attach him to a dog chain in the front yard to shame him and keep him from running away or destroying things when the parents were out. Mike's acting out didn't end in childhood. All through his adolescence, he was in trouble with the authorities. He had a severe learning disability in school and was regularly shamed by students and even by teachers. He lived most of his adolescence burdened by this shame. Seeking revenge, he would often break into the school at night and defecate on the desks of the teachers who had shamed him. He became a skilled burglar and was charged for several felonies before he was 18. His mother and the local priest always bailed him out and got the charges reduced. And after these incidents, his father refused to speak to him altogether, gave him the silent treatment, and let Mike know with constant contemptuous remarks how disgusted he was by his son. As often happens with patients who have suffered repetitive trauma of this kind, Mike told this story without any affect. He could not be sad or angry about the way his father had treated him. He couldn't even feel that what he went through was bad enough to deserve my compassion. This slowly changed as the field warmed up between us emotionally. Often Mike would present some horrific detail about his childhood with a dismissive macho attitude and swagger, black humor, and a cynical laugh, like the dog chain incident. Then out of the corner of his eye, he would see the painful look on my face as I took seriously the humiliation he must have experienced. This gave him permission to feel some of his own pain, and the result was increasingly that he could let himself drop into some of his own grief and sadness, laced with rage from his childhood humiliations. The wounded inner boy began regularly to enter the space between us, always still in the arms of the angels. One day, about a year into our work, he brought this dream. Here's the dream. We're in a huge hotel. I'm the bodyguard for this child who seems sacred or special in some way, almost like the Christ child. He's in an adjoining room. Somehow the child doesn't know who he is. I can feel the presence of an evil person, someone who has come for the boy and is very close by. I become vigilant, alert. Then there's an explosion set off by the evil one. I run into the child's room. He's 5 to 7 years old. The explosion occurred next door to him. He's in shock. I recognize him and know who he is somehow. The images of his life flash by me. I sit down next to this boy, knowing the explosion was only meant to tease. If they really wanted to kill this child, they would have. I now start to shake this boy. Who are you? I shout. Do you know who you are? His eyes remain fixed, then roll up into the back of his head. I see a little smile on his face. Perhaps I've made contact with him. But he won't look at me. I feel so frustrated. I leave the room crying out of helplessness. I can't make contact with this child. Then, in a final part, I'm trying to tell this dream to a man upstairs. A woman present has instructed me to tell him the whole story. I'm relieved at the prospect of this, but I'm blocked, like I've had electroshock or amnesia. I can't remember the boy's life story. I think perhaps I should go back for his history, but I'll never escape the evil one if I do. I wake up in a sweat. Now, this dream and others like it were my first glimpse back in the 1980s of how dissociation works to keep traumatic experience from being remembered, and how it does so with the aid of violent, angry affects, which try to kill, blow up, or annihilate the offending feeling memories. We see in Mike's case how the fragmented pieces of his feeling memories are coming into consciousness, and how the mad bomber resisted this with explosive anger. His dream gives us a picture of this inner struggle. It becomes a symbolic container of the opposites and a mini drama promoting the psyche's democracy. In the transference, Mike was allowing himself to feel the genuine grief and sadness of his childhood self. This was pictured in the dream as the special child in a trance. Mike's dream ego wants to make contact with this wounded, miraculous child, but this seems to antagonize the evil one who tries to annihilate the child. Later, the dream ego wants to tell the whole story to a man upstairs. A reference to me, Mike thought, because that's where my office was, upstairs. But again, he's prevented because the dreamer seems to have electroshock or amnesia or something, a clear reference to dissociation. So as healing begins, the pitched battle with defenses also begins. This is a classic example of what it's like to fight for a democracy of the psyche. As his psychotherapy begins, so also the integrative longings of his psyche for wholeness. There's an inner desire of the dream ego to connect with these alienated, injured, minority parts of himself, to redeem them and restore them to the human community from which they have been banished. But the authoritarian system, thriving on dissociation, resists this with a vengeance. In any case, as our process evolved, Mike was feeling the presence of his shame-wounded inner child, and he was feeling a lot more in his body. His eyes were tearing up frequently now in his sessions. Whenever this happened, his dark angel would take over. He would stand up, pace around the room, rage, clench his fists, curse, and then sit down to more tears, then more rage, and more pacing. Vulnerable feelings and the violent defenses against them back and forth over and over again, love and hate, slowly getting together inside him. Eventually, we were able to laugh about these eruptions. I told him he was like the famous Irish warrior Cuchulainn, who went into warp spasms of rage on the battlefield. And when he returned from battle, he had to be immersed. When he returned from battle, he had to be immersed in 3 vats of cold water. The first 2 boiled off his steam until he was then ready for civilization. Sometimes our sessions were like those vats of cold water. Sometimes by the end, Mike was ready for civilization again. He loved my calling him Cuchulainn. He liked being compared to a famous warrior. Negotiating with Mike's demonic defenses was a little like entering an Afghani village and negotiating with an Afghani warlord while seeking a meeting with his women and children. One had to start by acknowledging and giving full respect to the warlord's life-saving role in the life of this village and his family, giving this dark angel lots of respect and honoring. With enough of this recognition and appreciation, the guardian patriarch slowly seemed to relax a little and began to allow contact with the children who were hiding in the back room behind a pile of carpets. Now, for the first several years of our work together, I was spared any confrontation with Mike's inner Afghani warlord. I knew how touchy he was whenever I intervened in his victim-perpetrator narrative and tried to engage his younger, more vulnerable feelings underneath. His whole system was designed to protect the innocence at the core of himself. So if I suggested he was partly responsible for something that had gone wrong, a fight with his wife or a disagreement with his boss, it shamed him. He would flare up inwardly, but he didn't express it to me outwardly. In retrospect, I think I was sufficiently afraid of his anger not to push these moments. We might say that any of Mike's aggression tended to be split off from the positive transference with me and acted out in his road rage outside the hour. However, because he would continually report these incidents to me, and as these dangerous and compulsive explosions continued to happen, despite all our work on them together, I began to feel my own version of paranoid anxiety and shameful failure. As with many men who have suffered traumatic humiliation in early life, almost any frustration in our modern world could trigger Mike's humiliation, his shame, and his helplessness, and then his rage. Immediately, the rage would come up. Down would go his foot on the accelerator. Up would come his middle finger. And out would come the F words until he and the other driver were often pulled off to the side of the road, and Mike was bellowing like a wild bull. If the other driver got mad in return, a fistfight always ensued, and archetypal energies would pour through Mike. He was channeling his dark angel, and he was temporarily out of his mind. For a while, the road rage incidents decreased, but if a stressful period ensued in which his life at home or his marriage with his kids got stressful, he would often regress and revert to these old patterns. I began to feel inadequate and ineffective as his therapist. Mike told me his wife was wondering why his therapy wasn't working, and I began to have the same questions myself. I started to think about medication. I started to think about who I could refer him to. Then came the session in which the dark angel took over our process. Mike came in and confessed superciliously and with a cynical grin on his face to yet another incident of road rage, in which he had terrorized another man half of his size. He was completely activated, and I could find no regret, no guilt, no remorse, only the pumped-up hyper-arousal of his addictive violence. Sensing my discomfort, he changed the subject to some, quote, urgent issue with his wife. I sat seething, trying to listen with that old familiar feeling of helplessness and irritation. The thought that he was a psychopath crossed my mind, that he was simply too damaged for psychotherapy. Recovering my senses, I suggested to him that he was avoiding the most important thing we had to talk about, and I asked him what he was feeling. About what? He said with a cynical irritation. At that point, something snapped in me and I lost my mind. At least I lost my analytic mind. I was now completely activated and unable to contain my own emotion. Look, I said, and forgive the language. You are threatening everything you've created in your life, your profession, your family, your relationship with your wife, the boys, your relationship with me, all for the temporary high of your little shit-fit rages. You think you're getting even or administering some kind of sick justice, but the fact is you're just indulging yourself like a 2-year-old. You're just emotionally incontinent. That's your problem. You can't hold it. When are you fucking going to learn how to hold it? Not exactly an analytic intervention. Fuck you, he said, turning his head away, fuming, I'm out of here. And he lurched out of the chair, slamming the door behind him, and locked himself in the bathroom on the other side of the waiting room. Thank God there were no other patients in the waiting room. I sat shaking in stunned silence for a moment. Then I got up and followed him, stood outside the locked bathroom door. Mike, I said, I am really, really sorry. You didn't deserve that outburst from me. It wasn't any better than yours on the highway. Let's not let this wreck our connection. Let me in so we can process this together. We've got too much going on for us. There's a lot at stake. A few moments later, I heard the door unlatch from inside. I went in. He was seated on the toilet lid, head in hands. I sat on the bathtub and put my hand on his shoulder. Several minutes went by, with both of us finally coming back into our bodies. Then I noticed Mike's eyes welling up with tears. I waited for him to say something, but nothing came. What are you feeling? I asked. He looked up at me, and then he saw the tears rimming my eyes also. I don't know, he said. Sad. Grief about my father, I guess. And then Mike really began to sob. Nobody ever cared, he said. I had to take care of everything all by myself. I was always crying out for help in my acting out, but nobody got it. 4 arrests before I was 18, and my father never even spoke to me about it. All they could do was make me bad. You're not making me bad. You're not making me bad. Well, now I was really in tears. Suddenly, I felt this huge upwelling of relief and gratitude inside my chest. Relief because I really had made him bad in my mind. And I felt terrible about it. I really had hated him for a moment, turned him into the dark angel. And it hadn't destroyed him. And it hadn't destroyed us. Both love and hate, the good and the bad, were held together in this moment for each of us. But love was stronger, and hence the relationship was both preserved and deepened. This was a moment like the ones I described at the beginning of this paper, a paradoxical moment of shared vulnerability and yet transcendence. Mike took my hand and we just sat looking at each other in this wet, beautiful moment. It was like the balm of Gilead, healing and reconciliation pouring down on both of us. Trauma repeated, acted out, but repaired right there in the session. The little boy and the murderous protector, persecutor angel in both of us, present, getting to know each other. One of the ways to think about what Mike and I had lived through together would be as follows. The trauma of unshared emotionality with his father was too painful to remember, so it was dissociated. But the split and the longing for its healing didn't go away. Instead, unconsciously, Mike sought out a relationship in which he could live this through again, but to a different outcome. Repetition, says the late Boston analyst Paul Russell, has to do with what we cannot feel, so it's repeated, it's enacted in behavior without consciousness. The repetition compulsion, says Russell, is an organized system of affective incompetence, a dysfunctional feeling system. Some months later, toward the end of his analysis, Mike had an important dream. I felt this dream was a kind of culmination of our work together. It presents an image of healing and reconciliation between a father and his lost orphaned son. It profoundly moved us both and became an important storied image for our later reflection. Here's the dream. I'm part of a police force, and we're chasing this young man who's about the age of my oldest son, 10 or so. He looks like an Afghani child, neglected and lost. He carries an old newspaper in his hand. This boy has eluded us for years, yet now that we've captured him, I'm confused. He looks at me imploringly and says, "Is it time?" tentatively handing me the newspaper. The front page article is about this lost boy and about how his father wants him back. He's been lost or abandoned or abducted. In that moment, I recognize him as my son, as if he'd been a child of an old girlfriend I'd gotten pregnant. I'm overcome with grief and longing. All I can say is, "I love you." I reach out for him in an embrace and wake up deeply moved. Now, this beautiful dream heralded a major shift in our work together and a major integration in Mike's psyche between a younger, father-alienated part of himself that was clearly his, yet had become bad, a fugitive, shame-ridden, lost to his ongoing life, owing to the defensive system that had abducted him. Mike was in tears as he told me this dream, tears of recognition that this lost boy was himself, and that there was a part of him that had been deeply wounded in his relationship with his father and was starving and impoverished, abandoned in his own war-torn inner landscape. Now the newspaper says the boy's father wants him back. An integration of the least of these is now imaginable. It is time. I would take that time as kairos intersecting chronos. In this example, we're given a glimpse of the way the psyche seems to celebrate symbolically the recovery of its own lost wholeness and the healing of its dissociated parts. A father's embrace of his lost son. This is a victory for integration over disintegration, a victory for the democracy of the psyche, for inclusiveness, the victory of a conflict psychology over a dissociative psychology, made possible by the courage to gradually accept, with help, vulnerable feelings. And apparently this acceptance is only possible through the human connection. In this case, a love that was stronger than hate in Mike's and my relationship. The word consciousness means knowing with another person. So democracy is inherently relational. The word democracy is from demos, meaning people, and kratos, power. Hence power that comes only through, for, and by the people. Just like the psyche needs a compassionate field to hold its conflict, people need democratic institutions, laws based on founding documents, like constitutions and courts, for processing and adjudicating their own conflicting energies and opinions, for self-expression, and for suffering together the curse and the blessing of what it is to be human. From an evolutionary standpoint, and this was Jung's conviction, democracy is a new creature on this earth. It is the human child of consciousness, caught between two authoritarian spirit beings, violence and illusion, who do not wish it well. It may not survive, but whether it does is up to human beings. That's us. Thank you.
Don, thank you for that really insightful, interesting, and moving paper. And I'm looking forward to the discussion, but we're going to take a 3-minute stretch break. So please be back here. We're going to continue the program in just 3 minutes. Okay, welcome back. We're going to move forward with our program now. We're going to hear some short remarks from Olena Brante. Elena, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. It's my great honor to be here today, and I'm grateful to Donald, to all the organizers for this opportunity to be part of today's discussion. And today I would like to present a case. That's the case where a young, attractive girl asked me for help. She said, "Help me save my dad. He is not well-mannered, what he does, but he could not come up with a single example of what exactly his father did wrong." Let's go to the first slide of the presentation. Next one. So I will call her M. She was 18 years old at the time. She was living in Kiev, and she originated from a wealthy, respectable family. She had a brother a few years younger. She got a good education, good degree. Her mother had her own business. She was interested in psychology, coaching, and personality development. Her dad was a successful businessman, faithful husband to his wife. As a father, he provided M with attention, support, financial support, and advice. M impressed me as a sensitive, deep, profound personality, and she made me feel joyful surprise along with slight infatuation. Our work lasted for years. A lot of things happened, but I would like to briefly look at this story from the perspective of authoritarianism and democracy from inside and outside. M was full of categorical judgments about her own personality and the principle of pleasure, and her inner democracy had no voice. I will mention several examples of dreams that demonstrate the lack of inner structure and the essence of authoritarianism expressed through intra-psychic images. That was dream number 5. I'm going somewhere, and I see through a crack in the door that my grandmother, my dad's mother, is filming pornography in the next room, in the adjacent room. I'm outraged. I'm terrified. I run for my father to stop it, to put an end to it. My grandfather stops me. He's furious and he yells at me. Why am I shocked by what I see? He threatened to throw my things away. I think he might hit me. Dad is watching all of that as if fascinated. My mom gives me a torn sock. I'm not going to wear it. I decide to quietly leave them all. According to M, her grandmother was a bright, outstanding woman who sought attention at any cost, and she was involved in public charity. All family members found it difficult to deal with her. M tried to visit her despite of her own feeling of disgust and fear, because she needed to maintain the relationship, respect the elders, the family, and also because she did not want to offend her father. In the dream, porn is an image of the relationship. One can watch porn as much as they wish, but never feel loved or in love. However, love and eros, this is the territory of the superhuman, where everything can happen except for the scenario planned and directed by an individual. Very soon after we started working together, it turned out that M had a fear of revolution, which appeared in her dreams several times. She compared herself with aristocrats who were robbed and killed and humiliated for their wealth and privileges. Her father and mother tried hard to be together even though they fought. They made a lot of efforts seeking help from various specialists, therapists, coaches. Recalls, one night I heard my father and mother discussing divorce. The mother came up with arguments that were so logical, convincing, that they left me no doubt that the divorce would happen. They were trying to get divorced, but they could never do that. And each time when the three of us were there alone, that was like a trash situation. If there were four of us, it was okay. So I would deliberately invite the brother to join us. Otherwise, the mother attacked me and my relationship with my dad. I felt like a prostitute. I don't know why. M learned to hide the part of herself that the mother didn't like. The father distanced himself, demonstrating Zen attitude. He disappeared, hiding behind the ideas of Buddhist acceptance and love. The ever-present threat of divorce became part of the family atmosphere, and M learned to notice it without noticing at the same time. The family sought to achieve love, affection, and eros with the right, highly spiritual ways through self-development improvements, getting to know oneself, working hard. Both parents wanted this, but in M's unconscious mind, the idea and image of love was devoid of spontaneity and joy. That was about absence of choice that was simultaneously declared as existing, as being there. Next slide.
Olena, sorry, Olena, can we just stop for a moment? Could you please speak a little bit more slowly for the benefit of the interpreters? Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm sorry for that. Okay, so the dream, one of those dreams that signified movement towards transformation. M and her friend, who M hated, and M's mother are at the balcony. The mother tries to push her daughter off the balcony and leaves the friend, the other girl, next to her instead. M is hanging on the balcony with her hands, clinging at it to keep from falling. M started by developing her own business. She offered individual and group counseling on a certain topic related to rules, traditions, culture of behavior. It was something that she really loved, something she was good at and trained in. Things developed gradually. However, whenever we talked about her work, she would glow with inspiration. So it was no wonder that people did pay for her services. In our contact, I always experienced her presence as full of playfulness, attention to feelings, attention and respect for the vulnerable part of a person, as well as reflection, curiosity, and depth. And it was presence of depth and the availability of this reflection that alarmed me, but also fascinated me most. Because in my opinion, this did not quite correspond to her age, but for sure it gave me pleasure in contact with her. I always kept that aspect in my focus, seeing the signs of the self and grandiosity of the self's defenses. Personal relationships became the space where the revolution took place. The ego had the experience of death or dying. M chose partners as if from a mythical, a different reality. Although the men were not married, but it would be difficult to imagine marrying any of them without obstacles or sacrifices by M. Her first serious relationship would require her to change her religion. Another relationship resulted in a quick marriage with a man she knew from childhood, which made it romantic. Everything happened quickly. M looked a little confused, anxious, and scared. I felt fear, longing, powerlessness. My heart was clenching. During the first year of their marriage, M had to admit to herself that she and her husband had very different values. I watched as her frustration gradually grew, increased, turning to contempt and disgust, and how she determinedly tried to hold the tension of the internal conflict. Divorce was not an option for her. M intended to understand and accept her husband's, how he is different, to understand herself and her responsibility in the context of the marriage, and to adapt. She condemned divorced women. M's husband regularly attended the church, followed rituals. M immersed herself in religion, and she started her search between the poles of authoritarian manifestations of religious postulates, propaganda, and in-depth study of religion as a symbol and myth of the combination of love and law. Unconsciously, M was restoring her own system of deep symbols of good and evil, and in particular, the place of aggression. In search of help, both men and women turned to society, then to religion, to culture, different countries than to miss. Unconsciously, M chose the relationships that led her to contact with religion. Her body became a true container for contact with anger. During the second year of her marriage, M's body reacted with very painful boils that did not heal well. Exhausted with this experience of helplessness, at a certain point, she perceived these boils as a message from her body, like small volcanoes of her body itself that didn't allow her to lie to herself about her feeling of anger, did not allow her to avoid shame and helplessness, pretend that she could do everything, that she could mend the relationship, that she would re-educate her husband. The body is the first home of an individual. Authoritarianism, in my opinion, is living in one's own home with a lost experience of the space as one's own. Then a person no longer feels at home, free and at ease. Unexpectedly, it was the church that blessed her and thus directed her determination. M came across a stanza from the gospel where Christ was angry with people. It was the ability of the Son of God to be angry that became a true revelation for M. It seemed that at that moment she found the answers about lost God and love. Another moment was a conversation with a nun. The nun mentioned in passing that the church understood divorce. This made it possible for M to let the desire for divorce into her own consciousness. She did not yet have the strength to discuss divorce outside. However, the war forced M to recognize the inexorable reality of her feelings and the significance of this for her. It was the husband's political preferences that became the last straw. But M took a decisive step when her pet got lost and died. For M, this death revealed a temporal dimension, a phenomenon of inevitability. She packed her things and left her husband. The next night, she had a dream in which she gave birth to a girl, a baby girl. Thank you for your attention. And I believe that now I need to pass over to Oxana Zalesky. I respect her so much as my colleague and also as my mentor, my teacher, as a Jungian analyst. Thank you, Olena. Hello, dear participants of the webinar. Thank you for your support. Thank you, Donald. Thank you, Olena. And let me start. Ukraine has a long history of fighting for its independence, and recently it got rid of the totalitarian regime. So it is still struggling, searching, and creating a democratic path of development in its internal institutions. Schools are among the most undemocratic places inherited from our totalitarian past. And despite the desire for freedom and democracy in the general movement of Ukraine, the general vector, school education in Ukraine is still unreformed, Soviet, mostly authoritarian, and most discriminatory. This means that there is still coercion in school, a ban for free expression, psychological violence by adults, fear, lack of inclusive approach to diversity. Adults, both teachers and parents, still address children this way. Be silent, don't move. No one is interested about your opinion. You will do as I say. I remember 2014, the beginning of the war. At the invitation of Dr. Serhiy Bogdanov from Kyiv Mohyla Academy, I started working in Luhansk Oblast region, teaching school psychologists how to work with children who got traumatic experience. We created a program for children, which we later named Safe Space. At that time, we faced the fact that children, neither at school or at home, had the right to talk about what was happening, their feelings, emotions, fear, despair, regressive behavior, aggression were perceived as bad behavior, misbehavior that interfered with the normal process and required control. War games were banned. Children had nowhere to place their emotions. At the level of the system, avoidance of experience, dissociation of feelings, and authoritarian control were functioning with the noble objective of protecting the children, to protect them from feelings, memories, horrific experiences, and most importantly, avoiding conflict and tension for the name of order. And I think about supreme order from the Star Wars, because that's what happens at school. Everything is controlled from above. Children have no say. The only strategy that teachers could contemplate was to strengthen the educational component, to make children busy with tasks, homework, in order to prevent them from experiencing those emotions. Within the program, we propose something completely opposite. Talking to children, sharing feelings, creating rules for interaction with children, not avoiding difficult experiences, playing and taking care of contract and trust in the relationships. Of course, we faced resistance, but we didn't stop there. We worked with the teachers, psychologists. We tried to create an atmosphere for them to feel that trust, care, for them to meet a different approach to their inner child. And gradually, the warmed up adults were able to create this safe space for children, and they started implementing our program. I would now like to share a vignette where children recovered their capacity to live through difficult experience without dissociating from it. In one of the safe space groups, the children acted out painful scenes of losing homes, violence, murder, revenge. At first, those were individual games. Then the children would come together and play together. Their relatives started appearing in their stories. The sandboxes were divided into two parts. Both were showing scenes of war. Gradually, the games moved from the sandbox onto the floor. Children built military equipment with Lego and distributed the space and started building cities. The interaction between the cities was quite aggressive, with military attacks, captivity, and murders. My colleague and I were watching in shock, testifying silently. Sometimes, occasionally, we intervened to maintain safety. We waited for events to unfold, but we stayed available to the children. We didn't discipline them. Sometimes the children would invite us to play, ask for help, and we would respond for a moment, then go back to witnessing and experiencing everything that we were observing. There were a lot of feelings inside: pain, despair, horror. Sometimes I wanted to close my eyes. The children were playing forbidden, banned games, which they couldn't play in other places. I felt trust from children, but I didn't know what that would result in. I focused on supporting the process. That game lasted throughout the entire time until the group was over. It became more detailed, it developed. The children built the infrastructure of the city, symbolically rebuilt destroyed homes based on real life experience, and no longer wanted to be attacked. Road, railway, and airway connection developed between the cities. There were far fewer conflicts. Military bases were now separated and performed for the function of protection, of defense. They developed trade, exchange of goods, and cooperation. Children introduced social roles. They elected president, bankers, teachers, judges, salespersons. Right in front of our eyes, the game and children were gradually transformed. Conflicts did not disappear, but there was a place for discussion and resolution, which created trust.
Another project where we nurture the freedom of expression, the Jungian serial drawing adapted to wartime conditions. So this project is aimed at creating a safe and secure place, an opportunity to express all your feelings. You can draw the way you want, and whatever you want, I'm here for you. A boy named A, 12 years old, was referred to us by doctor 2 months after the onset of symptoms: anxiety, fear of death, sleep disturbances, refusal to eat, fear of vomiting, which led to a weight loss of 10 kilograms. When I saw him, he couldn't barely stand up. He was very emaciated, and something was tilting him to the left. At the first session, he couldn't sit, he just lay down. The symptoms appeared after he was hit by a rocket attack, during which he was with his father on the street. They didn't see any destruction or death, only felt a blast away when the loud sound. He described this experience as intense fear, and he said, "Something in me died." During our first session, I conducted psychoeducation. I normalized his feelings. We talked a little bit about what he likes, so what he's interested in, but all of them remained in the past. I didn't find any existing problems and traumas in the past, and I was very surprised by the strength of the reaction that the boy had in response to this attack. I thought there must be something else. During our second session, the boy started drawing. His first drawing is called Stop on a Journey, on a Train Journey. So here you can see it. So we can see a ship which is sandwiched here between two islands. I saw this drawing as an illustration of the boy's freezing, his abandonment of all his desires and aspirations. But at the same time, I saw it as a protection, as a shelter from the storm. In his second drawing, there was a helicopter, and the boy said, "This is my new friend. It will help the ship to continue its journey, and together they will go to Italy." It was already a direct indication of the good alliance that we had formed and the birth of trust between us. I was very happy. After this meeting, the boys started eating. After about 1 month and a half of our work, when some of activities were resumed, he made another drawing, number 7. It is called Two Friends. For me, it was a symbol of the unification of the two split parts of the psyche. Next slide, please. It was the return of his vital forces, healthy aggression. The boy returned to Aikido classes, and then it suddenly became clear that it was another factor in development of his symptoms. His mother burst into the classroom at the beginning of the session and began to accuse the boy of not doing his homework, of not having enough rest. She said that he should stop resting and start working. The boy said, "Mom, please go out. You're interrupting my work." So what happened? The boy felt better, and there was more pressure in his life, pressure, coercion, and psychological violence in connection with the school. The teacher pressured his mother. "He missed out so much. He won't write the tests. You have to control him. You have to make him do his assignments." The authoritarian system doesn't care about the children's experience. It is important for it to achieve results. The boy began to argue, to conflict, and defend his opinion. He was regaining his lost strength and mental energy, and the separation and processes typical of his adolescence were restored. I actively supported him while at the same time confronting his parents' desire to control and pressure him. In his 9th drawing, the Eye of Cthulhu. Next slide, please. Here you can see a hero on a dragon. The boy identifies himself with this dragon. The hero is fighting the Eye of Cthulhu. This is the motifs of a well-known game played by teenagers. But for the boy, it has its own individual meaning. He calls the eye all-seeing, and he says that it kills with its control and sucks out life. His friends help him. He's not alone. I rejoiced. I was impressed by the fact that he could defend his opinion, and I supported his desire to defend his boundaries. I tried to be with his feelings. I was interested in what he did. I was maintaining the contact between us to support his idea and his desire to grow and develop, because trust for me is the key to democracy. In conclusion, I would like to mention Winnicott, who said, the potential space between a child and a mother, between child and family, between individual and society or the world, depends on the experience of trust. It can be considered sacred for an individual as it is the place where he or she lives a creating life. And if the experience of trust is lost as a result of a trauma, there is no hope to restore it in special conditions of safe space and meaningful relationship, where creative life can re-emerge in a free play, where internal and external democracy is possible. Trust cannot exist in a totalitarian world dominated by an authoritarian adult. Trust requires equality. To nurture trust is to counteract trauma. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much to both of you. And now we're going to invite questions. So would you please put your questions in the chat? I'm going to start, if that's okay, and just say, you know, I just found your paper so helpful. I know it's going to give me a lot to think about for a long time, and it's going to help me think about many things that I've been mulling over. But just maybe an initial reaction today, and I think this relates to both of the presentations we just heard from Olena and Oxana as well. I'm thinking about freedom of speech, which seems to me to be an essential aspect of democracy, and a lack of freedom of speech is really goes along with authoritarianism. I suspect you can't have one without the other. And I'm curious about freedom of speech in my own culture. It seems like there's been an erosion of that. I know, in fact, that there has. There are so many things that we can't say. I know there's real issues with freedom of speech wherever there's an authoritarian regime. And of course, we can have our own sort of lack of freedom of speech and illiberalism within the psyche. You know, I've heard it said that the consulting room, sometimes I'll say this to my analysans, this is a place where you can say anything. And you catch people starting to kind of censor themselves. And I say, don't do that. Say whatever you want to say. You can do that here. But we do it to ourselves too, don't we? We, you know, as in the case, for example, that Elena was talking about, there are things that we're not allowed. We tell ourselves we can't think. There are things that we're not allowed to feel. So, Don, I just wondered, you know, if you have any additional thoughts about this issue of freedom of speech, inner and outer.
Well, speech is the voice, right? Voca, vocation, the way we make what's inside outside and express ourselves, right? So it's absolutely central to a democracy of the psyche and to the expression of all the different parts of us. Someone, I think it was Reich, who talked about the voices of the inaudible. So a lot of what we do in therapy is to try to find the voices of the inaudible, the voices that haven't been able to be heard or haven't found the courage to, or even the language to speak yet. You know, Donnell Stern, who's written a book called Unformulated Experience, says that one of the ways we keep ourselves unconscious and dissociated is that we avoid spelling things out. We may sense certain little flash pictures of a reality that we need to become conscious of. Maybe it's a feeling, maybe it's a memory. But by keeping everything disaggregated and disconnected from each other and not spelling things out to ourselves even, and not giving language to unformulated experience, we keep it unconscious. So yes, I mean, speaking out is an essential part of a democratic inner world and a democratic outer world. And we see it all over the world now. Look at the silencing that's going on in the Soviet Union, for example. But as you point out, we have it on our own college campuses, authoritarianism on the left,
Mm-hmm.
cancel culture, and all the rest of it.
I think it's really everywhere.
Yeah.
And now I'd like to pass the baton to Dmytro Zalesky and let him ask a question. Dmytro.
Hi, Dmytro.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
So I would like to get back to the key theoretical position on transcendental function, especially at the collective level. When we talk about dissociation, when we remember this, the demon, then we shall remember that he dwelled in the hell, and these are the key characteristic of this demon. And this is exactly how life during wartime is perceived from outside, especially if you associate yourself, identify yourself deeply with your country. We cannot even have a proper rest, because a rest is just a short pause between two suffering, between two tasks. So for us, this is very important. This is a story where we do not have enough space for happiness, but we do have a space for work. And our colleagues demonstrated just that. We cannot get rid of this power of splitting power of this demon. We can only lie to ourselves. We can only have illusions, and then we are caught by another demon. So our destiny, our fate is to continue fighting to our survival, for our survival. We are going this way, but this is a hell of a journey. So this is pure hell. But I do hope that we will win, and individuation will lead us to purgatory. But on this way, we have the chance for deep changes. My colleagues have said a lot about it. They told us a lot about this in-depth rebuilding of the Ukrainian society at different levels of education, psychotherapy, national identity, at the level of basic positions of our society. So, and we cannot avoid this fate. We do live through this hell, and there's no way out. But if we get out of it, probably we'll reach some level of transcendence, but not before that. So what do you think about it, Donald? Can you reflect on that?
Well, yeah, I think this is one of the contributions that I think Jung made that is not well appreciated, namely that there's a layer of the psyche and the world that he called the collective, which is made of binary opposites, extremes, extreme emotions, extreme opinions, everything polarized and extremified, if that's a word. And that's the archetypal dimension. So when we're in a war, we're in the archetypal world, right? I mean, we're fighting between extremes. Right now, Ukraine is struggling, having its own innocence, its own humanity violated by bombs, by the powers of explosions, by extremes, by the extreme of authoritarianism. And democracy is not possible in a war zone. Democracy requires a container, and in war, all the containers are broken. So there's no choice but to defend oneself when someone is trying to kill you. It's life or death. It's good or evil. There are always options within most Western cultures where people who do not wish to take up arms can find alternative ways of helping their countries, called conscientious objection. And that's terribly important for some people who do not wish to take sides and do not wish to split between one side and the other. But even that becomes highly problematic when your life is threatened, when your country is threatened. So right now in Ukraine, I know you have this struggle between people who are trying to defend the country as patriots and others who don't want to fight and trying to make room for them, which I think is an important part of all civilized countries, to make room for people who cannot, or for their own reasons, join that fight. But it's like entering an all or none world. It's like entering hell. So I I don't have a lot to add, Dmitry, except to say that it's in the in-between places. It's in the Middle Earth, down here on Middle Earth, where the transformation of the archetypal extremes is possible. And that's what we keep trying to do. We fight this war. We hope, God only knows, we hope that Ukraine ends up liberating its own territory and returning to the integrity of its own country, and so that it can embrace democracy again. But until that time, you have to fight. There's no alternative.
I think I misspoke and said put your questions in the Q&A, but please put your questions in the chat. So sorry about that.
You're muted, Max.
Thank you so much. I would also like to tell everyone that you can ask your questions in Ukrainian. We have first question from Anna Koroluk. She asks if he can compare coping mechanism of psyche in a totalitarian Soviet Union and a contemporary China. Are there any similarities or differences? Can you please elaborate on that?
Well, that's probably beyond my my depth, or outside my wheelhouse, as they say. I don't know enough of the political realities of how to compare the two, but both are authoritarian regimes, and that's the essential similarity. I mean, you don't find in either country tolerance for other points of view, minority voices, minority races, minority religions, and there's tremendous fear that drives the authoritarian system. Somebody once, I grew up in a gun culture in America, where we hunted and fished in the woods of northern Wisconsin, and my father and all of his cronies belonged to what's called the National Rifle Association in the United States, which is an extremely powerful gun lobby in the United States right now, and has single-handedly populated the streets of America with over 300 million guns, so that the American citizens and traumatized kids are killing each other with an alarming frequency. And everybody in my father's generation talked about how strong they were having guns. Now, guns are defenses. You don't need defenses unless you're terrified, unless you're afraid. And all of these men were afraid. And what were they afraid of? They were afraid of communists. They were afraid of communists taking over the country. And of course, then once the communist menace became less powerful, they started to become afraid of other things, of terrorists. And now we're all afraid of China, and justly afraid of the Soviet Union. But authoritarianism is based on fear. The narrative at the center of all authoritarian governments is terror and fear of invasion, fear of takeover, and every new and creative energy that's ever come into being on the face of the earth has immediately been attacked by the authoritarian order of the old order. I mean, that goes back in mythology as far as the Christian myth, where as soon as the Christ child is born, King Herod sends his soldiers to kill all the infants. It's like as soon as creative potential is there and a new possibility can be created, it's a threat to the old order. And so violence, which is the dark angel in the system, begins to come out. So that's a basic archetypal structure of the authoritarian old rule of the old order and the new creative dimension of what starts to emerge in the psyche.
Thank you, Don.
Yeah.
Questions are piling up. Could I ask the next one, which is from Anne Cutek, and she says, how much do you think internet and social media is a virtual collective unconscious with the characteristics of demons and illusions?
Well, I think it's a very good point. I think we are entering an area where extremes thrive on the internet, right? On social media. And social media then becomes a way of avoiding the harder realities that we all confront at this time, I think, as humanity. I really believe that we as a generation right now are being asked to hold and make space for and struggle with realities that no other generation on the planet has ever faced. And I hope we are equipped to do it. Depth psychology is really a terribly important instrument in that coping. But when you consider the amount of violence unleashed in the world right now, the proliferation of weapons, the proliferation of tribal warlords all over Africa, the inequality that has been wrought in the world by the excesses of consumerism and capitalism, the destruction of the planet, the burning up of our own home. These are things that no other generation has really ever had to face. And to add to the social media and the internet, which allows everybody to find a little silo of like-minded illusionists to hide in, people who they can talk about the latest conspiracy theory with. You see, conspiracy theories are always more attractive to us than the complexities of not knowing the meaning of something. If we have to struggle with the great complexities of modern life and the difficulties of a complicated industrial service industries and so forth, we would far better retreat to the simplicities and the bumper sticker truths, so-called truths of authoritarianism and conspiracy theories. So, the internet, social media is like the collective unconscious, and unfortunately, I'm sure there are good things about it too. It brings people together. It offers linking and linkages all across the world. We wouldn't be having this conversation if it weren't for the internet. So it has pluses and it has negatives, but I worry about the ways it pours almost like gasoline on the fires of the extremes right now today in the world, and what we're being asked to understand and to hold and to find a way to transform.
Next question from Salamia. She's asking about how our internal authoritarian system makes it possible to also engage humor, the sense of humor, and how the role of that. I believe that this question is addressed to all the speakers today. Yeah, I'd like to comment if possible.
Good.
I believe that a sense of humor, it is the first thing that gets undermined. As I can see in my practice, based on my experience, I see that the sense of humor either disappears, the perception becomes very flat, or it gets distorted. Sometimes it takes the forms of sarcasm, which tries to pretend it is humor. So it loses ease, it becomes aggressive. So it is about distortion.
Mm-hmm. Oxana, do you want to comment? Oh, okay. I'll tell you a little story about how Mike and I, my patient, found our way to some humor. It happened that while I was working with him, he was building a house out of the materials on the land, like cutting his own trees and making lumber and building a house. And I was doing the same thing 50 miles away. And we didn't know this when we started working together, but we started to run into each other at lumber companies where we were buying hammers and nails and things like that. So many of our sessions, which were very fraught with his extreme emotions, were laced with humor about our various building fiascos. You know, we would fall off of ladders, and we'd have our tractors turn over on us, and we both had broken legs. And anyway, we had a lot of humor, and I had a tractor, which was called a John Deere tractor, and he had a Kubota tractor, and he never stopped reminding me that his tractor was bigger than mine. And so we would have this sort of macho, we don't have to worry about, you know, tender feelings in this part of the conversation. We are really tough guys with our hammers and our tractors and so forth. And then we could drop into some of the humor that was a part of. I don't think we would have gotten through as much difficult material as we did without that sense of humor. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, there are more questions than we're going to have time for, but quickly, Alessandra Di Montesimolo asks if freedom of speech could be changed to freedom of expression. And she says, it seems to me that sometimes sand play, drawings, or other words of expression, when one is wordless, by personal and collective authoritarianism, are essential to access our wounded inner self.
That's a wonderful point. I mean, you know, Jung always said that the symbol is not a sign. The symbol always ranks beneath the mystery that it's trying to explain or trying to express. So if you have a feeling that's unexpressible, or an emotion that has no words yet, and you can symbolize it in the sand tray, say, or with a piece of art like Oksana's beautiful children's art, it starts to give expression, and that is part of becoming conscious.
Thank you. There are many expressions of thanks. Go, Max. Go.
There is a question, and if I may add, regarding self-expression, again, going back to the theme of children, it seems to me that children, when they grow up, at the same time, they aspire to democracy, to expressing themselves fully. They do not yet have the capacity to express themselves verbally using words, because they're just discovering that and exploring. Thus, they do that through their creative work, forms of arts. On the other hand, they aspire to order, which will create space for them as well, so that they also had a say, so that they had an opportunity to establish that order together with grown-ups. And then it makes it possible to avoid just one-sided order or authoritarianism, if it is possible to share that in that sense, to share that responsibility, even with kids, even if they're young. This is how democratic schools operate throughout the world globally. I hope that all schools eventually will become democratic.
Beautiful. Me too.
Well, it's just so frustrating when we run out of time. We could go on because there are some fantastic questions. Many thanks. And we'll save the chat so you can read those afterwards. I'm sorry to everybody who didn't get their question asked, and to Hugh, who's had his hand up for a long time, but unfortunately we need to stop and move on to Lisa.
Well, I just want to thank all of the speakers today for this rich and moving discussion about democracy and authoritarianism, inner and outer. And I also want to thank all of you who joined us today. I hope you'll all consider making a donation. We're going to put the link in the chat, I believe. The money goes to support our colleagues in Ukraine who are doing important work under extremely difficult circumstances. And your gift will help Ukrainian Jungians and Jung's ideas to continue to survive in Ukraine amid this time of crisis. Jung's ideas are a real medicine to a cultural crisis such as this one. Our profession is one that is badly hit by the war. Many people, of course, can no longer afford therapy, and therefore many of our colleagues have lost their livelihood. But the need for psychological support is overwhelming. So many of our colleagues are working extremely hard and bearing a great deal. And in addition, they're dealing with their own struggles and helping support elderly parents, trying to deal with increasing inflation and humanitarian issues. So again, we've put the donation link in the chat. You can click on it now and please consider giving generously. We suggest making a donation equal to your hourly rate. If you're watching this at a later time via recording, I hope you'll also consider making a donation if you haven't done so already. And of course, for those who have contributed, thank you so much. Know that your generosity is making a difference. So we're also in need of more sponsors for these webinars. The sponsors cover some of the costs of the webinars, which is why we're able to send all of the money that we raise to Ukraine. So sponsors can be individuals or organizations, and the cost is only about £150 per webinar. And we'd like to thank the BJAA for their generosity in sponsoring this webinar.
Thank you, Lisa, for being such a wonderful chair. Before we say goodbye for this month, just a few quick notices and announcements, if you'll just stay with us for a few more minutes. Firstly, the closing date for the Social Dreaming Matrix groups is tomorrow. Many of you will recall that we ran 9 reading groups at around this time last year. These groups were immensely powerful, intense, moving. They were really quite extraordinary experiences. And this time the groups will meet once a month for 4 months to hold a social dreaming matrix. Social dreaming matrices, as many of you know, can themselves be profound experiences for the participants. I also believe that the attention that is paid to the collective unconscious in such matrices contributes to what Jung called the magnus opus. I mean, it may just be a small contribution, but without the tiny contributions, transformation isn't possible. And most importantly, these groups are an opportunity to engage with our Ukrainian colleagues in a smaller, more intimate setting. They've been set up at their suggestion, so if you can, please do participate. The flyer's on the ARIS website. There may be a link in the chat now that you can just click and then look at when we've finished. And after booking for the groups closes tomorrow, the group lists will be issued in case anyone has to swap for whatever reason. Our very best wishes to all the conveners and all those participating. May it be an enriching experience for you all. Now, next month's webinar will be led by Verena Kast and Olga Kasyanenko and is on the subject of coping with grief. I first heard Verena speak when I was a trainee many years ago now, but I was struck then by her wisdom, depth, and compassion. The webinar will take place on Tuesday, 24th of October. And now I'm afraid a sad announcement. Reluctantly, WJ has taken the decision that we can no longer provide the interpretation into languages other than Ukrainian. A key member of the WJ team has been offered the job of her dreams. Congratulations. And so we're now at the point where we no longer have the resources to manage and organize the translation and interpretation other than into Ukrainian. Like any committee, we've had members who've need to step back for all sorts of good reasons. And we have no paid admin support as all money goes to Ukraine. So we're now really severely stretched. If more help is forthcoming, we'll try and reinstate it. So if you would be willing to serve on the WJ committee for the next 8 months, please email me. And it may be that my email address is now in the chat, but I'm sure you will know how to get hold of me by now. In the meantime, I would like to say an enormous thank you to our team of interpreters. Hopefully they're going to be spotlit over the next few seconds, who have so generously provided their professional services without charge in support of Ukraine. It has been touching and humbling that these interpreters have reached out to support our colleagues in this way, and we're really sorry we can't continue to make use of it. I'm going to name them and to ask if they will give a quick wave so you can see who they are. So thank you for all that you have done. Angeline, Katia, Chiara, Louisa, Monica, Lisa, Antje, Sylvia, Luciano, Ludmila, Anna, and all the interpreters who are not here today but help out on some of the other webinars. I hope this is just adieu and not goodbye. A quick thank you also to our other sponsors, Wordly Wise, Sanctus Media and Gap, and finally to the WJ team who put in such a huge amount of work and without whom nothing would happen, especially Claire Mouchot, Sally Arthur, Marilyn Matthew, Joseph Cox and Tom Yates. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Helen Morgan, who's been heading up the organising of the Social Dreaming Matrix groups. A very significant amount of thought and work has gone into their preparation. And so now the time has come to say goodbye for this month to our Ukrainian colleagues and all those at risk. We pray you and your families stay safe, and we look forward to seeing everyone next month. And so we invite you to stay with us for just a couple of minutes more as Neil plays Lysenko's Prayer for Ukraine. Thank you.
Боже великий єдиний, нам Україну храни. Волі світу промінням ти її осіни. Зрости.